Hello. For this week, we're going to be talking about the development of early medieval Christianity. And our focus is going to start with Anglo-Saxon Christianity. So I have a map up on the course learning site that shows the general contours of the region of the British Isles that we're talking about that you might want to refer to. What we have here is a transition from Roman Britain to a variety of Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. In the year 406, the Roman army withdraws from Britain, and this leaves a power vacuum. The indigenous British population is weakened, and there are invasions that happen by invaders from Ireland to the west and Picts from the north in what's contemporary Scotland. In a response to this series of invasions in the year 440, the British people, who are really a Celtic ethnic group, invite Anglo-Saxons to come provide protection from them. So you can look at another map I have up, which generally just shows medieval Europe. And so these Anglo-Saxon pirates are coming from the regions that we would now identify as parts of northern Germany. And small bands initially cross the North Sea of Anglo-Saxons and begin to settle along the coastlines. And that eventually becomes a pattern of waves of migration and settlements into the British Isles and what we call England today. There it develops a whole narrative and mythology of the Anglo-Saxons crossing the North Sea to be something like the Israelites engaged in their exodus to the Promised Land by crossing the Red Sea. And there's actually a famous Anglo-Saxon poem called Exodus that, in a way, imagines the Anglo-Saxon people as another Israel coming to the Promised Land of England. This is actually a very powerful mythology in English Christianity of England as a new Israel. And we're going to keep on seeing this ideal pop up as we encounter various iterations of English Christianity across time. So hold on to that concept. There are churches that do exist in Britain during this time period that have been established by the Romano-British population. So it's really an earlier form of Christianity coming with the Roman army and Roman settlement. We can find these in various walled cities like Bath to the west or London along the Thames, or on estates of various aristocratic landowners. Once Rome withdraws from Britain, the church structure there becomes fragmented and isolated. So we do have monks and bishops in certain regions who often see themselves in a minority position vis-a-vis the rest of British culture. And so these tend not to be real leaders in post-Roman British society, but rather in some ways cultural critics. We have very spotty evidence for them, though. Our best source of evidence about Anglo-Saxon Christianity comes from the writing of a figure known as Bede, or the Venerable Bede. So for the rest of this video, I just want to talk to you a little bit about Bede and what we know about him and his contributions for our knowledge about Anglo-Saxon Christianity. He lives in the late 7th to early 8th century. He is pledged as a child oblate at age 7 to the monastery of Wearmouth in Northumbria. And again, you can refer to your map to see where Northumbria is in the north of what we call England today. A child oblate was a pretty common category in this time period. Families often had multiple children, and usually the youngest child was pledged to a monastery or convent around the age of 7. And when they came to the age of maturity, sometime around 13, 14, 15, they could decide if they wanted to stay in the monastery or convent or return back to their families. Bede was one who chose to stay. This practice of child oblates also exists in other religious cultures. We can see it still operating in some aspects of Buddhism to this day. Bede is famous for his Bible commentaries that he writes, which are often synthesis and summaries of what earlier Christian authors composed. And so his Bible commentaries served as a good um, reference for early Christian Bible practices. He wrote Latin grammar, he wrote computations and chronologies as he assembled calendar systems and records of time. And he is actually a person who helps popularize the use of the word Anno Domini, or AD, in the year of our Lord as a system of dating. So our system of dating time to the birth of Christ is something that Bede helps to develop and refine. Prior to then, time in Western Latin cultures was marked according to who held authority in Rome, especially regarding emperors. He also writes hagiographies or lives of saints, especially his lives of Northumbrian saints like Brendan and Cuthbert are quite popular. And he is most famous, though, for his composition at the very end of his life in the year 731 of the ecclesiastical history of the English people. Now, note what that title says. This is a church history. It is not a political history, an economic history, or a social history, although these are things that we can glean from Bede's writing. This really is a theological accounting of the development of the church in England. And it's really focused on the Anglo-Saxon settlers and their church, not the prior church that existed there with the British, of which he is a great critic. We'll get to that later. Nor is he concerned with the existence of Christianity in Ireland or Scotland or Wales. And even more to note here that throughout this lecture and for Bede's works, when the words Anglo-Saxon and English are interchangeable. When he is writing about the English, he's talking about the Anglo-Saxon. Similarly, when we have the word British appear in Bede's writings and in this lecture, we're talking about the Celtic peoples that we now call the Welsh. Wales is on the western edge of the island where we find England. And this comes from actually Anglo-Saxon itself, where Welsh was the word for foreigner. So our word Wales or Welsh is actually an Anglo-Saxon term for an outsider, whereas the Welsh people themselves call themselves the Cymry. So we have some linguistic things we also want to attend to there. We need to be careful when we look at Bede's history that he is working with a limited set of sources. He writes about 130 years after Augustine of Canterbury is sent to England by Pope Gregory in Rome. He's writing 300 years after Anglo-Saxons have come to England. So there's big gaps of time here. And he's working with a limited set of sources. Primarily, he's working with a series of letters that Gregory the Great composed in conversation with Augustine of Canterbury and other leaders of the church in England. And he has gotten copies of his letters from the papal repository in Rome. He's written and received copies. He's also working with a history written by a monk called Gildas, who's British, that is Welsh, called De Excido Britanniae, or On the Destruction of the British. And this is an important resource for him. And then he's also written around to all areas of monasteries and such in England, asking for chronicles and reports that they might have. And he stitches all of these sources together to create a unified history of the church in England, or of the English people. And he's writing with a specific purpose, which is to show the English people how to imitate righteous behavior and how to especially encourage the English or Anglo-Saxon kings to model right behavior so that the people might grow in Christian virtue and so that the Christian identity of England might be consolidated and reinforced. So I hope that gives you some good information for thinking about this history. And in the next video, we're going to go into some more detail around specific themes for Bede's ecclesiastical history and think about how this will help us think about processes of enculturation and contextualization in early medieval Christianity. Okay, I'll see you soon.